Capturing a castle in the Middle Ages was never about a single dramatic assault. It was about patience, pressure, and inevitability. Castles were not meant to be taken quickly. They were designed to delay, exhaust, and discourage attackers long before swords ever reached stone. The first reality of medieval siege warfare was distance. Castles were placed deliberately on hills, ridges, cliffs, or surrounded by rivers and marshes. Reaching them already cost time and energy. Supply wagons moved slowly. Armies arrived tired. Defenders watched from above, protected, prepared, and calm. Once an army arrived, the siege truly began. And most sieges did not start with violence. They started with isolation. Attackers cut roads. Bridges were destroyed or guarded. Messengers were intercepted. Nearby villages were occupied or burned to prevent resupply. The goal was simple: turn the castle into an island. A fortress without food, water, or hope would eventually fall without a single stone being breached. Time became the primary weapon. Inside the castle, stores were counted carefully: grain, salted meat, dried peas, wine, ale. Everything was rationed. Wells were guarded. Rainwater was collected. Livestock was slaughtered early to conserve fodder. Every decision assumed weeks or months of waiting. Outside, the besieging army settled in. Camps were built, trenches dug, wooden palisades raised. The siege was a temporary city facing a permanent one. Disease spread faster than arrows. Latrines overflowed. Food spoiled. Morale fluctuated constantly. This was why sieges were avoided when possible. They were expensive. They tied armies in place. They killed without glory. But when a castle blocked territory, controlled a road, or symbolized authority, it had to be taken. If starvation failed or time was limited, pressure increased. Psychological warfare came next. Defenders were shown captured allies. Threats were shouted. Promises of mercy were offered and sometimes honored. Other times, examples were made. Nearby villages were punished visibly. Smoke carried messages. Fear was meant to travel faster than siege engines. Negotiation was constant. Terms shifted weekly. A castle commander's duty was not to die gloriously, it was to hold until relief arrived or resistance became pointless. Surrender was honorable if justified by circumstances. Pride mattered less than survival. If no agreement came, engines appeared. Siege towers were built from timber hauled from surrounding forests. They were massive, slow, and vulnerable to fire. Rams were constructed with iron heads, often protected by wooden roofs soaked in water or hides. Their purpose was not to smash walls immediately, but to weaken gates over time. Walls themselves were rarely broken by brute force alone. Mining was more effective. Tunnels were dug beneath walls, supported by wooden beams. When complete, the beams were burned, collapsing the tunnel and the wall above it. This was dangerous, exhausting work done underground, in darkness, often while defenders countermined from inside. Sometimes tunnels met. Fighting occurred beneath the earth. Missile warfare never stopped. Archers and crossbowmen exchanged fire daily. Defenders targeted engineers. Attackers targeted anyone who exposed themselves. Stone projectiles from trebuchets smashed roofs, towers, and morale. Even if walls held, life inside became increasingly dangerous. Assaults were usually the last resort. Scaling ladders under arrow fire meant heavy losses. Oil, rocks, and boiling water fell from above. Narrow wall walks favored defenders. A single man could hold a breach against many if space was tight. Casualties mounted quickly. Failed assaults destroyed morale faster than hunger. This is why commanders hesitated. Every assault was a gamble. Most castles fell not to force, but to time. Water ran out. Food spoiled. Disease spread. Hope collapsed. When surrender came, it was often quiet. Gates opened. Terms were read. Flags lowered. The garrison marched out alive sometimes. Other times, mercy was denied to discourage resistance elsewhere. Castles were not taken by heroes charging walls. They were taken by accountants counting grain, by engineers measuring stone, by commanders calculating patience, and by defenders watching supplies vanish day by day. This is how castles were captured in the Middle Ages, not through spectacle, but through pressure applied slowly, deliberately, and without mercy. And this was only the opening phase. As a siege dragged on, the balance of suffering often shifted not toward the defenders, but toward the besiegers. Armies outside the walls were exposed to weather, disease, and supply failure. Rain turned camps into swamps. Summer heat rotted food. Winter froze men in place. A castle was built to endure seasons. An army was not. This is why many sieges failed without a battle. If relief forces approached, the besieging army faced a decision: fight on open ground or abandon the siege. Fighting a relief army while stretched thin and sick was dangerous. Many sieges ended abruptly, not because the castle resisted successfully, but because the attackers could not afford to stay. When pressure had to increase quickly, commanders turned to escalation. Trebuchets became instruments of terror as much as destruction. Stones smashed towers, walls, and roofs, but their most effective targets were not military. Wells were hit to contaminate water. Living quarters were targeted to destroy morale. Sometimes corpses, human or animal, were hurled over walls to spread disease and fear. This was not symbolic, it was practical cruelty. Defenders responded in kind. Counterfire targeted siege engines relentlessly. Skilled engineers were hunted specifically. A single bolt killing a master builder could delay progress for weeks. Fire arrows rained down on wooden towers and rams. Buckets of water were always ready. Defenders understood that stopping construction mattered more than killing soldiers. Mining intensified this silent war. Underground, men worked by torchlight, listening carefully for vibrations that signaled enemy tunnels. Countermines were dug hastily. When tunnels met, fighting occurred in cramped darkness. Knives, axes, bare hands. These encounters were brutal and unseen, yet decisive. Collapse could kill dozens instantly. Psychological strain inside the castle grew unbearable. Food rationing sharpened divisions. Soldiers ate first, civilians last. The elderly and children weakened quickly. Disease spread in cramped conditions. Waste disposal became difficult. Water grew scarce or polluted. Defenders watched trebuchet stones arc slowly through the sky, counting impacts like seconds. Hope depended on relief. Signal fires were lit. Messengers were sent through tunnels or at night, risking death. If no answer came, morale cracked. Once belief in rescue vanished, surrender became inevitable. Assaults came when commanders judged resistance near collapse. They were timed carefully after bombardment, after starvation, after disease. Multiple breaches were attacked simultaneously to overwhelm defenders. Ladders rose. Siege towers rolled forward. Drums and horns amplified noise to disorient defenders. The fighting at the walls was the most violent moment of the entire siege. Narrow spaces eliminated numbers. Men fought at arm's length. Defenders pushed attackers back with spears, hooks, stones. Attackers forced entry inch by inch. Corpses piled up, making footing treacherous. Blood slicked stone. If attackers gained the wall, the battle was not over. Inner gates, courtyards, and keeps remained. Each layer demanded another fight. Defenders retreated upward, narrowing space further. Castles were designed to fall slowly. When the final resistance broke, restraint often disappeared. If defenders had resisted long or refused surrender offers, punishment followed. Executions were public. Looting was permitted. Rape and slaughter occurred despite promises. This brutality was deliberate. It sent a message to other castles. Yet mercy was sometimes shown. A garrison that surrendered early, held honorably, or negotiated well might march out alive. Commanders weighed reputation carefully. Too much cruelty invited stubborn resistance elsewhere. This is why siege warfare was as much political theater as military action. Every decision when to starve, when to assault, when to spare echoed beyond the walls. Castles were not just stone. They were statements of control. Taking one meant proving dominance not only over walls, but over time, fear, and will. And even then, victory was never clean. A captured castle was often damaged, depleted, and costly to hold. The war continued. Another fortress waited, because in the Middle Ages, power did not move quickly. It advanced one wall at a time. As the siege reached its final phase, exhaustion became more decisive than steel. Both sides were depleted, but only one side could leave. Defenders were trapped inside collapsing routines. Sleep came in fragments. Hunger sharpened tempers. Commanders struggled to maintain discipline among men who had watched friends die slowly from disease and starvation rather than combat. Inside the walls, hierarchy hardened. Soldiers received priority. Civilians were expected to endure. When supplies dwindled further, harsh decisions followed. Non-combatants were sometimes expelled. Women, children, the elderly pushed out to reduce mouths to feed. Attackers often refused them passage. They starved between walls and camps, visible reminders of what resistance cost. This cruelty was not accidental. It was calculated pressure. Water, more than food, decided outcomes. Wells contaminated by bombardment or deliberate poisoning turned survival into arithmetic. Thirst weakened bodies faster than hunger. Once water failed, resistance collapsed quickly. No wall could compensate for that loss. Disease thrived in these conditions. Dysentery, typhus, infections from untreated wounds. Illness killed more defenders than weapons ever did. The smell inside besieged castles became overwhelming. Corpses could not always be buried. Sanitation collapsed. Morale followed. Commanders watched carefully for this moment. Negotiations intensified when defenders showed signs of collapse. Flags appeared on walls. Messengers approached camps cautiously. Terms were debated endlessly. A castle was valuable, but so was reputation. Granting mercy encouraged future surrenders. Denying it encouraged fear. When surrender finally came, it was rarely dramatic. Gates opened slowly. Weapons were stacked. The garrison marched out under watch. Sometimes they were allowed to leave with honor. Sometimes they were imprisoned. Sometimes they were executed immediately. The outcome depended on context: how long they resisted, how much they cost, and what message the attacker needed to send next. For civilians, fate was unpredictable. Some were spared. Others were enslaved, expelled, or killed. Looting followed almost inevitably. Soldiers expected payment for months of hardship. Commanders struggled to control this release of violence. Often they did not try. A captured castle was not immediately useful. Walls were damaged. Towers were unstable. Supplies were gone. New garrisons had to be installed. Repairs took months, sometimes years. A siege victory was expensive long after it ended. This is why castles mattered so deeply. They consumed time, money, and lives. They forced wars to slow down. They turned campaigns into tests of endurance rather than speed. A single fortress could halt an army for an entire season. And this is why medieval warfare looked the way it did. Battles were rare. Sieges were common. Power moved slowly because stone resisted haste. Commanders learned to think in months, not days. Victory was measured not by motion but by patience. The men who captured castles were not always those who fought hardest. They were the ones who waited longest, who maintained supply lines, who kept armies intact while disease and boredom threatened to destroy them, who understood that walls were not defeated by rage, but by pressure applied without interruption. Castles fell when resistance stopped making sense, when hunger outweighed pride, when hope of relief vanished, when commanders accepted that survival mattered more than symbolism. This is how castles were captured in the Middle Ages, not through a single moment of violence, but through a long erosion of certainty, stone by stone, day by day, until the gates opened, not because they were broken but because there was nothing left behind them worth defending.